Hey guys, imagine at your house you have a window that has a broken lock, so anybody from the outside could walk up, open the window, and enter your house. Now imagine again that your neighbor Jim finds out about this and he posts on Nextdoor letting the whole neighborhood know about your broken lock. Most of you out there, the next step you would do is actually fix the lock. Now, while this analogy is simple, it represents the same mentality we should be having with vulnerabilities that exist on software that's installed across our workstations with our end users. In most cases, though, this is very overwhelming to think about because we have hundreds of applications installed on those devices. So there's a lot of constraints there when we talk about consistent monitoring and then the SOP or steps you would take to go ahead and remediate those applications. And this all comes back to a governance layer of an approved software inventory, which is what I've been talking about the past few weeks. But in today's episode, I'm going to be showing you a native first-party agentless solution from Microsoft that allows you to do 24/7 continuous vulnerability scanning of all the software applications installed on the workstations in your environment. And I'm going to be showing you the best practices as far as getting that set up and the steps I would take to prioritize an approved application inventory. Okay guys, so as we dive into approved software inventory, first I want to talk about why it matters so you can explain this to your customers as in the sense of why should we have a consistent monitoring tool and what processes should we be implementing here to have an approved software inventory. So when we talk about one lens, it's obviously the security lens that we have with these vulnerabilities acting as a backdoor to our cybersecurity, where ultimately no matter what the application is, it could actually lead to a user getting compromised, that device in nature, as well as the application itself. And for the business, this can lead to data theft, financial loss, ransomware attacks, system downtime, and reputational damage. So very consistent with what you would see in any type of cyber attack, but it's important to recognize just because it's something that's often overlooked and it's really hard to manage because of the hundreds of applications that are maybe installed on the workstations across our environment. The other lens or consideration that you need to have is obviously having applications that are installed that maybe aren't malicious in nature, maybe don't have vulnerabilities, but could be used in malicious ways. A great example of that is the following, and I talked about this in a previous video, but this is an attack diagram of an attacker signing up for a Microsoft tenant, flooding a user's inbox with spam, and then impersonating a help desk in Teams, but actually leveraging the Quick Assist application on a Windows device, which is installed by default and activated to actually get a remote connection into that device and then proceed with their attack campaign, which in this case was either installing malware, starting a ransomware attack, something like that. So it's very important that we take a look at an approved software inventory to make sure that we have unimproved applications uninstalled or disabled, as well as taking a look at that consistent vulnerability management. Now, if you've been following along the past few weeks, you know I'm doing this little mini series on a secure software application inventory, and we've gone through a couple of the layered protections here. The second, which we talked about having and restricting things down so that users have to go through an approved work stream. So this video basically assumes that our users are not local admins on the devices. They can't actively install applications themselves unimpeded, and they can't register them with Microsoft due to the interest settings that we've set. So this is taking a look at, the next stage here, layer 3 protections, and double click on this, which is application vulnerability scanning. And today we're going to be looking at the native solution with Defender in Microsoft, which is known as Defender for Business or Defender for Endpoint. I'll cover the licensing here in a minute, but quickly just wanted to showcase the vulnerability management platform or dashboard within the Security Admin Center, the Defender Admin Center here. If you don't have the licensing, you won't be able to see this tab, but we'll go through that again here in a minute. This dashboard, though, gives you what's known as the exposure score, much like Secure Score, if you're familiar with that, which allows you to see kind of a pulse or credit check, if you will, against the security of the devices. And it really relates to how tightened you've configured the security settings on that device, as well as the downstream applications, whether they need to be updated in some way from a software perspective, or if they need to be hardened as well. So this is a little bit more in depth to cover, but when we talk about our inventories and things like that, whenever you set this up, which I'm going to show you how to do for Windows devices today, you actively get this software inventory list here. And the first thing that you'll say whenever you start looking through this list is, oh my gosh, there's so many applications. I don't even know what half of these are in general, and if they should be installed or if they're a risk. So today we're going to go through how I would look at prioritizing these and some of the steps from an SOP level perspective that you can take to help in the sense of chipping away at this list over time. It is a best effort type of practice that you have within here, and really leaning into maximizing your time as part of this as well. When we take a look at these vulnerabilities though, we can see a lot of meta detail here on the initial dashboard, such as the impact score. So kind of giving you a predefined priority list that you should be looking at, the exposed devices, in the organization. So this kind of takes a look at where the application's installed and the exposed devices that maybe have an older version that's leading to the CVEs or weaknesses that we see on there. We have threats that are actively shown here, and they're highlighted in red here if there's a public exploit. We have the number of weaknesses, the vendor, and so forth. If you click into one of these though, you'll be able to see a little bit more detail like the installed devices. This is just a test tenant that I'm showing you here, so there's going to be more limited view and scope of all the detail. But in a production tenant, you might have hundreds more applications that you would see in this list. If I click on the open software inventory though, I can see more of a summary of this information, but I get all of the security vulnerabilities that we can see here. And this is something that I would like to pay attention to, the age, because this is going to help you out a little bit later. But we get the publishing date, first detected date in your environment. And then you can see even the version distribution across your devices here. So you can see if there's some really old versions that really need to be updated versus maybe a version that's one behind as well. You get the installed devices within here, and you also get all the security recommendations for this app that you would want to go in and apply, and that'll help boost or actually reduce, in this case, your exposure score that you saw here on this vulnerability dashboard. From a licensing perspective, the really cool part is this actually is baked into Microsoft Business Premium, known as Defender for Business. It is this vulnerability management core capabilities line item here as far as this breakdown. And it also comes in Defender for Endpoint Plan 2. The interesting thing is if you have Microsoft 365 E3, you do not get that because you have Plan 1. So just a call out there if you see that or don't see these tabs within the Defender Admin Center. So before we get into kind of how you prioritize the remediations and inventory here, I first want to show you how to onboard devices and activate this from onboarding Windows devices within here that you're going to end up being able to see on this page. So within the portal here, you'll go down into the settings tab. And one of the first things that you can do is go into the endpoint section here. I'm going to pop back into the advanced features, but if you go into onboarding, there's a couple different ways that you can onboard devices. If you're just looking to do some testing to start, you can actually download this onboarding package and facilitate a script on a single device. It's up to 10 devices like it mentions here. If you're running a hybrid environment, you can leverage group policy to deploy this en masse. Recall that this is agentless, so there's nothing that you're pushing out from an actual MSI or executable. It's really a setting that you're activating on the device, and you can actually do that. The most preferred way that I'm going to be showing you today is through Intune and having devices already in the MDM solution. And this is simply just setting up a profile to activate Defender, and they'll automatically start registering within here, which gives you a lot of benefits that will span across the next few weeks here of videos. Within the advanced features though, if you come in here, you can scroll down and you can actually turn on this Microsoft Intune connection. Make sure this is turned on and click on Save Preferences. This will go ahead and activate the connector that I'll show you here next in Intune. And then the only other thing that I typically do and recommend within here is in the email notifications, you go into the vulnerability section and you modify this notification rule that goes out actively to your PSA tool if you're an MSP or to a support help desk. So you can begin to track these. Take note that you will get some noise if you have, Windows 11 devices as an instance, right? It captures the OS within this as part of the vulnerability tracking. And it is likely that you have patching set up with a deferral window. So you might get notifications that there's high level severities, on the OS itself, but those devices not necessarily haven't gone through your patching cycle, and they're not 0 days, which is a different type of alert that you would get that you would want to act on immediately, obviously, within those use cases. If you did want to tweak this further, you can actually go through a setup wizard and configure this on a more granular layer so that it goes to different boards potentially in your environment, or you're getting something set up to avoid creating a bunch of noise with the OS updates as an example of that. But I would like to have that in place just to track it from a ticketing perspective. If we go now into the Intune Admin Center, this is kind of the next step that you would work at in the sense of the final profile that you want to set up to start tracking your endpoint devices. If you go into the tenant administration section here, and we go under connectors and tokens, and you scroll down to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, you'll see this enabled whenever you turn on that setting, and you can configure some more of these granular settings here. I typically don't touch these, especially since I'm not actively usually installing Defender and activating it on iOS and Android devices as an example within that. But just know that this will take a little bit here to set up and configure. The other thing that you want to set up is in the endpoint security section. If you go under endpoint detection and response, you'll want to go through and actually create a default policy. You could have, if you click on the onboarding section here, you can go in and deploy a pre-configured policy, which is going to take the default settings, which is what I would recommend. But those settings in nature are really just saying, let me go through this process here. I'm just going to say this is test. These settings here are really just saying, what client are we using for the configuration package? And we're going to select auto from connector. And this is basically going to allow us to leverage that established connection so that any of these devices here in Intune, depending on the assignments that I set here, will be enrolled into Defender. And in most cases, that's going to be 1-to-1 as far as what you would want to see there. So once you set that up, it'll take some time before you get all of this kind of rolled and seeing the devices within here. But then you can also see them actively start reporting into the devices section here as well. I'd wait, 24 to 48 hours before taking a look. Honestly, it takes that long to propagate. But this also gives you kind of a top level exposure level based off of the number of vulnerabilities that are detected and security recommendations on that device. So that's again where you could create a sense of priority if you're looking at this for the first time after onboarding, or if you've already had this activated, never really touched this, in the sense of where I would start to prioritize my time. Okay guys, so back in the inventory section here, I want to give you guys some tips on how to start to think about managing this list and where to prioritize your time outside of the impact score, because that's really where you want to start, obviously, with any public threats or any applications with any vulnerabilities. But you also kind of want an SOP to follow as far as what to do with these applications to scale out this with a business or the businesses that you manage over time. So within here, we have this entire list of applications. And really, when we take a look at that, I've built out this matrix here that we're going to follow in the sense of kind of a decision type of matrix that you would want to take. And within here, we can ask ourselves, number one, is this an approved app, yes or no? And if it's not, we're typically just going to open a ticket and we're going to remove the app from the singular device or multiple devices. So in this case, we could take a look at Chrome and say, is that a supported browser that we have? And in likely a lot of cases that would be. So it's not something we're going to remove, but we may say that Firefox is not a supported browser in the environment, and we may want to remote into that device and remove it if it's just a singular device here, or do that programmatically either through Intune or our RMM tool, some type of script that we can use to remove the application off of all devices if the scope's a lot higher. But if it is an approved app, we might want to go ahead and add it to an approved app inventory and document what it's used for, or that it's just approved to begin with. And this again could be a spreadsheet. I'm going to show you how to use CloudCapsule here to mark apps as approved. You could use that as a baseline. But really, that's just getting us into the concept of having these as approved so that other people in our organization or other technicians could take a look at that and say, I know what that is, and I know that I should be looking at this as an approved lens versus should this application even exist on the device? Is this new? Something like that. So within here, the next question you'd really want to ask yourself, is this centrally managed? Meaning, do we deploy and patch this centrally with our RMM tool, with Intune, something like that? And in the case of Chrome, we may say, no, we don't, but we probably should start, deploying that and deploying the updates because it's so widely used in the organization. It's the preferred browser by most of the users. And if it's not something you find that you should centrally manage, like this Node.js app, maybe that's on one workstation, just used by one developer, but not really actively deployed to the rest of the organization, you might be saying something like, no, we don't want to centrally manage that, and then flow into this next action. In either case, though, we're really going to take this intermediary step of seeing if any actions really need to be taken. And what I mean by that is, in this case of Chrome, as an example, we can go to the software page and we can see, the discovered vulnerabilities, but we also want to take a look at the age here. And the sooner it is to today's date, as in this wasn't released that long ago, the more likely it is that this actually just hasn't gone through an automated patch cycle. The most common example I can give you is just with your OS in general, where you have that deferral window for updating Windows 11 as a use case. And that's actually going to be captured in the next patching cycle that device has with that deferral window. Similar use case could be seen on other third-party apps like this browser with Chrome. And there's some use cases, the further you go out, it's likely that that application needs to be updated manually, or it hasn't been opened a while to update if it works like that. But you could also see in this version distribution table, users or discovered devices here that have, maybe potentially much older versions that need to upgrade immediately versus something that's one iteration cycle behind and it's not a critical 0 day that you need to look at patching. So that really comes into your decision matrix here as if it needs to take action, or you need to create a ticket on either side. But if you're not going to be centrally managing this, you may want to go ahead and just say, hey, we're going to remote into the device and we're going to update it. Again, you could send user instructions on how to update it if you trust them, which is not a use case that we usually have within our environment. But the other way, that you'd want to do this is if you are centrally managing it, you're going to deploy these updates programmatically as well. So this is another, high level diagram. You could potentially adopt this more textual view of this within here, but this gets you into this use case of, okay, we have a way to prioritize that list. Now, outside of, these considerations as far as what do I do after I get through these weaknesses and these public exploit apps? What about the rest of the, let's say it's 155 applications that I have within my environment? How do I go about prioritizing that particular list? And there's a couple of ways, that you can begin to take a look at that. You can actually export this list. I like to do that because I have more flexibility in Excel to kind of manipulate the columns here. And I'll show you guys that as we pivot into that Excel worksheet. This is an example export that we gotten from there. And typically outside of the weaknesses and exploits, the next thing I begin to take a look at is eliminating the Apple and Microsoft vendors within here. So I'm just kind of looking at the third-party vendor publishers within this list, and it gives me a good indication of other third-party applications that could be non-approved or shadow IT in a lot of ways that I could further drill down. And if you want to do that, the next best thing to do outside of the vendor is to filter based off of the total machines. So in this case, again, this is just a test environment, so I only have this up to 3, but you basically want to sort this list based off of the number of machines that it's installed on. Much likelier use case, obviously, that's an approved application versus something that's just kind of rogue that either one person maybe needs or that shouldn't be approved at all. After that, though, you can skim this list and start to take a look at, any application that looks suspicious in nature or something that relates to shadow IT, like a third-party file storage solution like Box or Dropbox, as an example. And you can begin to narrow this down. So browsers, as a use case, and any other third-party apps, that were being leveraged for password managers or for, business applications that shouldn't really exist on the device. It's a great place to start, as far as taking a look and narrowing this list down to say what's approved and what's unapproved. Again, there's going to be a lot more applications in the average environment. So actually, if we pivot back to CloudCapsule, I can show you a different example with a tenant that has a lot more applications. Okay, so over in CloudCapsule, you can actually run a free assessment by going to cloudcapsule.io and seeing more of this information. But this is a tenant that I've navigated into in the app section here and seen that we have over 750 software applications. And obviously there's various ones in here that you can see as more of a public exploit, probably something you'd see on a more production scale. You can actually export this as well and maneuver around. I just wanted to show you this for the sake of the example here. After you go through those applications again for, public exploits and weaknesses, you could also look for specific third-party threats. And specifically, I'm going to take a look at a couple here, like TeamViewer as an example for that remote connection software. I see that it's installed on 170 machines. So likely that is probably the legitimate remote connection software that I have within here. You would obviously know if you're the MSP, whatever remote connection software that you're using. But we could also look for something like Splashtop as an example and see this is installed on 27 devices. So begs the question whether or not we should have both. And both being on there represents somewhat of a security concern, but obviously would require some investigation to be had with that. The other one here that you could see is taking a look at, seeing that we have 101 machines that have Dropbox installed. And if you're using OneDrive as an example, this might be some shadow IT going on where that's not even governed, but 100 people are using it. The same thing is true. We see one machine actually has Box installed. So this is a lot of the investigation you can begin to do within a tenant to basically surface, those highlighted conversations you want to bring to a QBR conversation with your customer and talk about this cleanup. The other thing that you can do within CloudCapsule here natively in bulk or one at a time is actually approve these applications. You can use CloudCapsule as your approved application store and work these through. So unapproved software is really where you're going to take a look at. We haven't either reviewed it yet or it has a ticket opened and it's going through an offboarding process with this as well. So with all these steps, guys, there's kind of a runbook you can follow. We have it in the concept of a playbook, which acts as a project, that you can use over time or as part of a streamlined roadmap with the customer. This is how I've been showcasing these findings to you today, but all of this can actually be exported to a customer. And within here, you can go in and you can see, devices with high exposure. There's none in this environment here. We can chip away at that inventory over time and provide this report continuously to our customers. This is summarizing and filtering for those known exploits and weaknesses for the device list that we want to really take a look at first in the sense of priority. And then this goes through our overall checklist of what we would want to be paying attention to in the sense of, do we have all of our devices enrolled, within the Defender solution? Obviously, number one, getting some steps to do that. We can kind of showcase a list of devices not managed that are in Intra, but not in Intune as an example of this. You could also get into that checklist I talked about for, an SOP. And within the first 30 days, that's where you want to take a look at those applications. 30 to 90 is kind of where you want to filter that list and begin to have a roadmap for managing those, removing them off of the workstations, things like that. And then in the long-term improvements here, this is where you get into periodic review of a quarter list. I introduced to you guys in the previous week's video kind of an automated way that users could request new software workflows that would properly go into an application inventory that you can use and monitor over time. So that should be where you flow today if you've locked things down from people not being able to install apps over time, and then really just focus in on the vulnerability management, obviously, versus the shadow IT conversation. So all this is part of the approved software inventory workflow and something that you guys could begin to follow today. Okay, guys, that's everything I had for you today. Definitely comment below with any questions you had, and stay tuned for next week's episode where I'm going to show you actually how to enroll macOS devices into Defender, much like we saw today for the Windows devices. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next week.